Yeah, that's me, making a mess of my model. It was right about here I started questioning if the hobby was even for me. But let's go back to the start and see how I'd get myself out of this mess.
There's been a lot of love for that build video, and most have agreed with my thoughts on this one being one of the best value kits on the market. So today I'm going to take you through the steps I took to paint and weather this cut price kit to make it shine in your display case.
You look like a groovy panther.
Yeah.
Picking up where I left off from the build video, a basic mask is made for the running gear that I'd pre-painted using alfoil and some masking tape. I need to ensure I protect that paintwork from the previous steps, and the foil is an easy product to bend around the parts and then finish the masking with strands of that tape. A static brush can then be used to remove any particles or debris, and the model is primed in a Mr. Surfacer 1500 straight from the rattle can. I'm planning on painting this angular striped scheme that comes in the kit, but as I've previously mentioned, I've got serious doubts around how it's displayed in the instructions. From what I understand, the stripes were tightly sprayed and not hard-edged as that colour plate may suggest, so I'll be displaying my model as such. Now, freehanding continuous straight lines and controlling overspray can be a pretty tricky proposition, so I thought I'd put these real colour markers to good use and start to map out the plan of this scheme. My plan was to draw in the yellow lines by loosely following the instructions, and once happy with the positions, I could go back through with the airbrush and colour in the segments. I guess you could do this with a pencil to map out these shapes, but by using that dark yellow marker, I will already have the foundation to build up my dark yellow stripes. And I can see you all squirming in front of the screen, wondering how I'm going to make something that looks so horrible at this stage into something that looks half respectable. So stick with me and I'll show you how. Once satisfied with the placement of those stripes, I mix up the AK olive green with a few drops of ivory to lighten that colour a touch. By keeping the paint thinned to around 50-50 thinner to paint, I can get a good flow and easily keep my coverage in between those stripes. There are so many variables when it comes to thinning your paint, so take those callouts for what they're worth. I find this latest generation AK Real Colour doesn't require as much thinning as their older line did, or say a Tamiya paint for example. I also find the way this gallery airbrush distributes the paint requires less thinning to get a decent result, and I promise I'll be making a video for you soon talking about thinning and the things to look out for when painting for yourself. My application is again in that mottled fashion to allow that black primer to influence the finish. A busy scheme like this can benefit from tonal variation rather than just having two solid blocks of colour sitting on your model. It helps move the model away from looking like a toy, and it gives a sense of age to the finish. Now I can move to the rot brawn, and I'm using that previous generation Real Colour simply because that's what I have access to at this time. This time I add a touch of yellow to lighten that red-brown, and by adding that yellow it will ensure it keeps some vibrancy to the colour, as adding white would turn it more towards a pink tone. Now this version of the paint requires around 65% thinner to paint ratio in order to give me a reasonable opacity and a controlled paint application. And you may notice I made a few corrections to the yellow lines, but tidying those up was just a matter of spraying over them. When applying these colours, it's okay to paint over those yellow guidelines because I'll be going back with that dark yellow at the next step and re-establishing those lines. Probably a complete waste of time, but masking and spraying the turret ring was a strangely satisfying process. Granted, it looks a complete mess with those colour blocks in place, but this next step will bring everything together and will be the make or break step for this scheme. The AK real colour, dunkelgelb or dark yellow if you like, is lightened with the ivory and mixed into the cup with around about a 65 to 35% thinner to paint ratio. And I'm firstly lightening the paint because I know subsequent steps will tend to darken the finish, so lightening that paint will compensate for that. And secondly, I am thinning this more than I did previously because having that paint thinner will better help me control overspray and give me a far more controlled application. I make my way around the model, painting in the straight lines and creating a clean demarcation line between those two colours. It's important to not attempt to draw your line all in the one go. Draw the line on the flat panel that you are working on. You want your airbrush to be perpendicular with the surface of the model and reasonably close. And then rotate the model and apply the line on the next flat section. Soon enough, the lines will all begin to connect and the scheme will begin to make sense. Although debate online suggests the barrel would probably have been finished in a grey primer, I do like that striped pattern, so I masked with a fine piece of tape and then sprayed that complementary colour over. With all the masks removed, it was starting to look pretty impressive. Now you know I love a highlight, so I lightened my olive green up again with the ivory, but I also added yellow to this mix for the same reason as before, because the ivory can tend to desaturate this colour. I'm also thinning this to around 70% thinner to paint, because that would ensure a semi-translucent finish to the paint and it would make sure that that lighter tone blended nicely with the base colour. I'm focusing this coverage predominantly over the horizontal surfaces and staying well within those boundary lines. These highlights are creating volume over those surface areas, and as the black primer did with that initial green layer, they're adding an additional tonal layer in the paintwork. Now I didn't highlight the red brown because that colour has the risk of looking either too chalky or too rich. The decals could then be set in place, and I'd usually gloss varnish prior to this stage, but felt that the integrity of that surface was good enough to not bother. I'm not sure if it was the thickness of the carrier film, but even after an overall satin varnish, I wasn't really happy with the look of the decals. So I took to it with a fine grade sanding sponge, and it was used to wet sand that carrier film down to a point where I was happy. This will all be sealed with a varnish. This Panther is a late war example of the tank, and as such, I didn't want to damage it too much. Adding chipping is one of those techniques that can be a little misunderstood, I find. In reality, chipping wasn't as prominent as we as modelers might like to think, but applying it in a refined way can add a textural element to the model and help create a realistic looking finish to it. I'm using Tamiya iron and a sponge to apply refined chipping around the model. These Tamiya paints can get quite sticky on the sponge, and that helps with keeping the chips small and localized. Heaviest chipping is done around the skirt armour, and lesser amounts are applied around grab handles and leading edges. These are indistinct chips that just add volume rather than representing chipped paint as such, although you could make an argument that that is kind of what they're doing. Heavy chipping is then applied around the exhausts, and it's done particularly around the cavities at the top of that exhaust pipe. This will represent burnt and damaged paint and is really easy to create. I'd left the various tools off previously, and they could now be painted and fit to the model. Acrylic paints are used here and applied using a fine brush. And as a bit of an experiment, the jack block was first painted in a red brown, and then cork brown was used to paint a grain over that part. Lighter tones of grey could then be used to enhance the look of that grain, and to add a degree of life to that section, a couple of coats of clear yellow were applied. The effect needs some refinement, but I think for the most part it came out pretty nicely. The toe cables were burnished by just applying some burnishing fluid over the wire, and then the shackles could be painted to match. There was a certain sense of satisfaction fitting the tools around the model, and I'm securing them here with super glue so as not to damage the paintwork using a modelling cement. The paintwork is then sealed with a 50-50 gloss and satin varnish. Now the glossier the varnish is, the harder it will be to get the next stages of the weathering to grab, hence I'm adding a little bit of satin into this mix. Oil paints are a terrific trick to use when you're looking to give your paintwork a tired look, but more than that, using that oil dot rendering technique will create a filter over the paintwork and it will help unite the three colours that I just painted. I begin with white along the top, spaced around the tops of those shapes, and then I can add a cream brown and a shadow brown moving down the shapes. I'm focusing on the vertical surfaces, but I can apply a few dots on the horizontal as well. Then I'm taking a flat brush moistened with white spirit, and I blend the dots in that up and down motion, and I blend them over the surface. That brush is hardly even wet, as the smallest amount of white spirit will move those dots. I can even add in a few targeted streaks using oil paint and moving that shape in that same up and down motion as I did blending the dots. The whole model is then treated to the filtering process, concentrating on the vertical surfaces and again blending that up and down motion. It's the same techniques over and over. Limited application on the horizontal surfaces is blended using a different technique though. I'm using a dabbing motion rather than a streaking motion. This technique is softening the look of the paintwork and adding more tonal variation in that finish. This can tend to give the paintwork a little bit of a chalky look sometimes when it's dry, but the effect can be further softened with a gentle push around with a soft makeup sponge. An AK wash specifically designed for dark yellow vehicles is then applied around the model. The complex camouflage and the dot rendering can strip the model of its shapes and lines. So the hope here is that the pin wash will reintroduce those shapes to the model. I found that wash wasn't really working too well through the reds, so I went to a darker brown for those areas. After the wash had time to dry, it's back to that makeup sponge to tidy it up. The sponge is usually enough to clean up the enamel paint that didn't find its way into the recessed lines, but if they have been drying too long, a cotton bud moistened with white spirit will do the trick. As part of the round of washes, rust streaks and light rust, again, both enamel paints are applied over the metal tools and selectively over the spare tracks and quite generously around the exhausts. Once dry, this should work with the underlaying colours to create some more subtle metal-like tones. The tow cable is then set in place and a small pin bent from wire is used to secure it in place. It's a small detail, but one that costs nothing and makes a big difference to the model. Now I hope you're sticking with me because this is where the fun begins, but before we start, can I ask if you are enjoying this video, please be sure to give it a like, and if you're not already, please consider subscribing. It helps me grow this channel greatly. Now, chipping fluid is obviously great for creating chipped paintwork, but it's also great for creating textures in your dust layers. I first apply 2 coats of the chipping fluid, and soon after, the dust colour mix of about 90% buff and 10% dark grey is sprayed along the wheel and the lower edges of the tank's surfaces. Now that paint is thinned to around 50% thinner to paint, as that makes this mix semi-translucent for this style of paint, which is exactly what I'm looking for. I'm also misting this mix around the bottom edges of the turret and very sparingly on some of the horizontal areas. This layer is simply setting a roadmap for some heavier weathering effects that will follow. Immediately after that application, I take to the model with a flat brush and I apply water to the surface, and what that's doing, it's reactivating the chipping fluid, and I should be able to start chipping that dust layer away. Again, working in that up and down motion on the vertical surfaces is best because it will look like rain-stained accumulated dust deposits. Horizontal sections, again, I find that stabbing motion with the brush gives me a different look to work from, and having said that, your airbrush dust should have a very limited coverage on those horizontal surfaces until you get a feel for this technique. Maybe show some restraint in these locations for this exercise if you were building this along with me. Now, it's important to work your way around each surface. If you take too much off, don't worry though, I will be building on these effects in the next stage. I'm just creating a foundation or a roadmap, as I said, for these next steps. This process must be done during the one session. Because I've used a lacquer paint, and for the sake of the argument we will call them that, the longer I leave it, the harder it will become to remove. Acrylic paints will be much easier to chip at this stage, but I like using the lacquers. I just have to work with them reasonably quickly. Once satisfied, the model can again be sealed with a varnish. This time I'm using a 50-50 mix of satin and matte varnish here, as the matte varnish will help hold the oils and pigments that are about to follow. Now, dry pigments can be a little intimidating for some, but in reality they are not as tricky to use as some might think. They just need something to hold them in place, which is where the oil paints will come in real handy. But more than that, just like an artist would on a canvas, you can use the oils to create volume on your model by simply building and bulking it up. I'm using a combination of dust and light mud oil paints to create my initial colours. By lightly applying these with an old brush, you can see the textures I'm able to create. I'm using the dust layer I sprayed earlier to guide me in terms of placement. However, I'm working over a reduced surface area, so some of those interesting chipping effects I got earlier will still influence the look. Once the oils are in place, I can then lightly dust over that dry pigment. In this instance, I'm using European Earth, and I will introduce a dark earth colour, but in a limited way. The sticky oil paint is grabbing onto that pigment, and once dry, it will bind it to the model. I use these techniques on the horizontal surfaces as well, but I'm careful not to overload this effect. I'm trying to keep to some of the outermost edges and corners, because again, this is a technique that you can really get carried away with simply because of how enjoyable it is. Then you take a step back and you look at my model and it's like,
oh God, what have I done?
This technique is a world of fun though, and it is so easy to execute on your own models, and if you are feeling uncomfortable with it, try it on the underside of your model or in a place that will be covered up, like around the turret ring. As a general rule, your coverage should reduce as you move up the height of the model. Repeating weathering steps is just part of building a model, but in particular, armor models require constant correction. Each layer impacts the one before, so assess often and try to understand what impact the weathering layer has had on the model. Now, I'm reintroducing enamel pin washes here to add variation and reintroduce the details over the model. The pigment can absorb these washes, so something that looks amazing when you apply it might all but vanish 10 minutes after, so there will be multiple passes required. This step also helps the pigments bind to the model even further. Light dust deposits and North Africa dust gave me the colours I was hoping for to apply some refined splashing effects. Now, these are enamels with a high pigment content and are perfect for this type of thing. A paint brush is being flicked over a toothpick and it's used to apply the paint. I'm trying to use those other layers as my guide again. These speckling layers should be fairly low key and they're there just to enhance the look of the weathering. A brush and white spirit to make short work of any rogue or oversized splatters. This is a step I think detracted a little bit from the model, so I knocked it back as best I could and I made peace with it. Fine lead wire is blackened with burnishing fluid and weaved around the tie downs I'd fitted during that building phase. Adding elements like this give the model those irregular and organic shapes and help sell the realism of it. This was further exploited with a couple of spent shells being superglued on the engine deck, and these were taken from an old Tamiya release. A combination of dark steel pigment and lead pencil can then be used to polish the gun barrels and some of the other metallic elements around the model. The technique is also used over the raised surfaces of the tracks. And with that done, I'm calling this Panther complete. The Panther has earned its place in the hearts of many a scale modeler, and to be honest, it took me a while to understand what all the fuss was about. I mean, it was mechanically unreliable and guzzled fuel like there was no tomorrow, and its size hindered it in forested terrain and urban environments, and over-engineering complicated and slowed its production. But on the other hand, its sloped frontal armour design gave it excellent protection, and its long-barreled 75mm gun was excellent for long-range engagements and could handle just about anything the Allies could throw at it. Its optics and range-finding equipment were superior to its counterparts, and when it was running, it was considered to have a very good level of mobility. For us as modelers, the Panther offers so many possibilities with camouflage schemes, and the subtle changes made through the various version upgrades make for an interesting subject for us. Having worked with this one, I think I finally get the Panther and what the appeal is. Even purely from a geometric point of view, the angles and the lines of the Panther are something special and provide just about the perfect canvas for us to work on. But what do you guys think? Do you like the Panther or don't understand what the fuss is all about? I'd love to know, so let me know in the comments down below. And please remember to hit that like button, it makes a world of difference to this channel. Now, one of my goals with this channel was to help this community connect, but more than that, to help you guys bridge the gap of where your modeling journey is and where you want it to be. And I've been working closely with one of my Patreons, Peter L, with his Panther build, and I'm proud to have been part of his modeling journey and playing a small part in unlocking his own skill sets and helping him level up. Our Patreon community is growing by the day and is a great place to connect and improve your skills in a supportive and encouraging setting. So what's next, I hear you say? Well, that's a good question. I have a few projects in various stages of construction, so I guess it's a matter of seeing which one rises to the surface. But if you have any suggestions, please feel free to let me know in the comments down below. Remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family and share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. Until next time, I will see you soon.
Is that sex panther you're wearing?